Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to be talking about some of the common mistakes or issues that come up in walk cycles when students are animating the lower body and some of the upper body sections. There are some areas that typically get kind of caught in terms of just popping, and some other areas that are very common oversights when blocking in and animating the walk cycle. So I wanted to go over a few of the best practices and things to look out for. So taking a look at some of the most common walk cycle characteristics that prevent walks from being ideal or exactly perfect are mostly starting with the lower body and seeing some of these leg pops and making sure that your root translations are happening at the right times. So in this particular walk cycle, we can see it's looking great. The timing is good. We have some really nice reference to go from the side, and this is a great approach to start blocking in your poses. And some of the things that we need to look for are making sure that our root translations are happening at the right time. So making sure we hit the down positions and translating the root up. In this particular one, we need to translate the root up a little bit more on the up position, and you can see that the legs start straightening out here. And so when we translate that root up, we'll get a straighter leg here, which will then blend nicely into our contact position. Now in this particular pose, we can see that the leg is hyperextending and we need to keep a slight bend in that knee. And we'll talk about how we can work with these three controllers on the root, the foot, and the foot roll to kind of soften some of these hyperextensions that we get in the animation poses on the lower body. But overall, again here, this is the same thing with the root needing to be translated up. We're just needing to get that passing frame to continue to translate up. You can kind of see it's sticking here on frame 23 and 27. So we just need to get that root translated up and straighten that leg out, and then we'll be looking really good on this particular walk. Now what I want to show you is kind of how we get from some of these students' work and how it ends up looking really great towards the final once you make some of these adjustments. So one other view that we need to kind of look into is the front view. Now the front view is looking really great. I think the only thing that we really needed to kind of take a look at was the weight shifts. And the weight shifts were needing to kind of take place from the front view. When the leg starts taking the weight, we want to translate the root controller over the leg that's taking that weight. There's a nice little tilt happening on the pelvis and some rotation. That's great. And then we can already kind of have a little bit of a weight shift on the left side, screen left, but we might be able to push it a little bit depending on how much we end up translating this root here. So those are the two main adjustments that we need to look at in this particular walk cycle. The legs are looking really great from the front view, and they're very natural overall. And what we're going to do now is take a look at one other student on the lower body, and then I'm going to kind of show you how we make these, they made these adjustments and ended up making some really great walk cycles with these small adjustments. You can kind of see how these two animations come together. So this particular walk cycle also was really great. It was looking pretty nice overall, some really great timing and some really great poses. There were a few things that I thought could be a little bit better, which is also very common, is to try to get straighter legs on the contact frames. If we get too bent of legs, you can kind of see it in motion. It looks like the stride is a little bit confined and it's not quite as natural as it could be. So those were the main issues with this particular walk cycle. If you look at the root controllers, the root is translating up and down at the right times. So it's a little bit different than the last one that was kind of missing the up position, but this one is translating really nicely. What would need to happen here is probably maybe lessening the foot roll to get the legs a little bit straighter, and then we might need to adjust the root controller just to get some slight adjustment to try to get slightly straighter legs, and we would make that same adjustment here on the second contact frame. So those are some common things to look out for when you're working with your walk cycle, blocking things in, making sure those contact frames are basically as straight as you can get them, and kind of walking the Alt and arrow keys will kind of nudge the root controller and the legs so that you can get these straighter controllers when you're working in Maya. So that's one thing that we can look at, and we can see how these adjustments end up taking shape over the next 2 submissions. So in this walk cycle, what we've started to take a look at is the upper body, and we're starting to get that root translation happening in the lower body that wasn't happening earlier. And you can start to see that this walk cycle is starting to have a really nice character and vibe to it. You can see that they made that adjustment. It's a little bit bouncy. It's kind of nice because it does kind of break up a little bit of the even spacing. So you can see that with that root translation happening a little bit faster, kind of popping up here. So you can see with the spacing, with the root translating kind of quickly here, it gives a little bit more of like a happy bounce to the walk cycle, which actually kind of gives it a nice little strut type of feeling instead of it feeling very even. So that's a nice little touch there. There's a little bit of some issues with the legs, but overall it's coming together pretty nicely and there's no pops or anything like that. And we've layered on the upper body, which is looking really nice as well. One thing I was noting with the arms is just to add a little bit of a drag to those arms as they start to kind of hit their peak and recede backwards and forwards, just to give a little bit more weight. But overall it's looking really nice with those front and side views. And let's take a look at the front view as well. So from the front view, we have some pretty nice overall walk movements happening. It's a nice block and it's a great first pass. Overall, the issue that a lot of students are having issues with is the width of the arms. I think when you're starting to pose from the side, it's easy to lose track of how much your elbows are protruding out. So you can take a look at the negative spacing in here, and it's a little bit too wide versus something like this on the reference. It's a lot closer. You want to make sure that you don't have the arms penetrating the mesh of the character or getting too close. You still want to have a nice silhouette where there's some opening in the character, but not quite as wide as this, so that it looks unnatural, where there's these gaps in the spacing of some of your passing positions. So these type of poses look really nice. There's some nice silhouette happening here, but as you transition and you get some of these gaps in the character, you might want to basically kind of bring in these elbows a little bit closer to the character's middle section, and that'll make the walk look a lot more natural and it'll prevent this stiffness that we're seeing here. And another thing to kind of keep in mind is, you know, kind of giving some of this contrast in the hips and torso, kind of exaggerated this. For example, if you look at the reference, it's not quite as elaborate, but you can kind of see that there's some of this contrast happening. And then making sure that your head continues to be straight aligned is also something that you want to look at as you're adjusting the torso. Right now the head is kind of moving in the same angle as the torso, and it should be a little more straighter up and down. By countering that, that'll just keep the body lined up a little more, even if you're going to add a little more lean like this student has here. You can just counter that neck and head so it stays center aligned, and that way the body will look like it's more aligned, more like the reference that you see here. So those are some things to keep in mind as you're working through the front reference and the front view after you've blocked in your side views. So on this side view, this is looking really great. From the side view, we can see that some of these contact frames have been adjusted, slightly straighter legs. You can see now that the strides are looking a lot nicer, a lot more natural. Obviously, this is the first pass on the upper body and the hands. We got a little bit of movement there, which is nice. And one thing that I was noting here is to kind of give some counter rotation on the head. This is one thing that is very common to forget about. When the root starts going down, you want to rotate the head up to kind of give a little bit of that push and pull action so that you can get a little bit of drag and overlap on the head. It just starts to loosen up the body parts. It has a nice rotation already coming down when the root is going up. So you want to maintain kind of that push and pull contrast. So when the root is going up, the head will counter and rotate down, and when the root is translating down, the head will rotate up. So it's a very small adjustment. You don't want it to happen too much, because then the head's gonna kind of bobble up and down and look too cartoony, but just a little bit will add a lot. So as we get to the polish phase, you'll see that adjustment being made, and you'll see the difference that that makes, and you'll feel it more than you'll actually see it. So right here, one thing that I'm noting is if you kind of track the knee, it sticks a little bit in this area during the motion, and that's just something that can be smoothed out during the polish phase. So it's one thing also that is very common is tracking the knees as the body moves forward. You always want to keep these motions as smooth as possible. So in this particular one, if you kind of scrub it, kind of sticks a little bit. You can't really see it a lot, but when you look at it in motion, there's a little bit of a hitch there. So those are some things to keep in mind as you start to work towards smoothing out and polishing your animation poses once you have some really nice contact and down and passing and up position poses in your cycles. Moving to the front view, it's looking really great. I think we could add a little bit more of the translations over the leg taking the weight. So if you look at the root, it's looking pretty much centered the entire time. We have really great weight shifts happening already from the side. What we need to do now is add a little bit of weight shift into the leg that's taking the weight on both sides. So translating just slightly over the leg that's taking the weight, adding a little bit of tilt to the hips, and then giving a little bit of contrast in the upper body will help kind of put everything together and give more weight to the front view. Doing that for both sides will give this left to right movement and will help the weight read a lot better from the front view, because right now we're not really seeing much side to side movement in the lower body, and that also gets reflected in the upper body as well because there's nothing really to counter. So if you push the weight over and you tilt your hips and you kind of get those weight shifts, you'll naturally see that you'll have to compensate with the upper body to keep the body balanced, and then you'll also need to make sure your head and neck is centered, as we talked about in the last review with the other student, and that just keeps the body aligned but also breaks up everything so that it doesn't look too stiff while it's in motion. One last thing, again, just making sure you tuck in those elbows. This one's looking really good overall. It's just if we can tuck those elbows in a little bit more, it'll look a little bit more natural, so that when those arms are in movement, they won't look quite so stiff and that they're just kind of like robotic. So the other poses are looking really nice. It's just these transitions here, need to tuck those elbows in, make it look a little more natural. And when we get to that polish phase, you'll see those adjustments and you'll see how much more natural the walk starts to look. Okay, so these are basically your final walk cycles from these two students. You can kind of see how they put everything together. There's a few little hitches, but overall it's looking really great. So you can see that there's a nice little head movement happening. You can see that nice strut that's happening on the translations on the root. There are a little bit of hitches that are happening on some of the body parts, and that's basically the only thing that we really kind of needed to take a look at was some of these legs that were popping basically when the animation was looping. There's a little bit of a hitch right there. But keeping in mind is you're just always tracking those knees. You can see now that there's a little bit of drag happening on those arms like we talked about on the last pass, and it's looking really great. There's some nice weight happening. There's some nice drag on the fingers, and there's some really nice movements happening on the lower body as well. Looking at the front view, we can see that there's some nice little shifts happening in the left to right movement on the body. So you can see there's some little bit of translation happening on both sides. And again, I'm still recommending to keep that neck and head centered and countered a little bit more. I think if you keep that in mind, there'll be less shifting happening in the upper section. It'll keep the center line of the body a little more aligned, and you can kind of see that there's a little bit of some better posing with the elbows. So when you track those elbows from the front view, they're looking a little bit better. I think we can probably still tuck some of those elements in a little bit more, but overall you can see a really nice personality taking shape with all of these polish elements happening from the front view here. So for this last pass on the animation, this is looking really nice as well. The lower body is really coming together nicely. You can see some really nice knee movements, and the lower body is working really nicely. You can see they've cleaned up their spacing on the knees, looking really great. Some really nice strides, And the you can see that the head is also having a nice little bounce based on the root movements. So those are great improvements as you start to see those counter elements happening in the neck and the head. And you can basically kind of look at what as only thing that I thought could be improved was to maybe get a more natural hand pose, something that's maybe a little bit closed, a little bit more relaxed to kind of transition to this one. But it's nice that there's a big contrast in the posing from frame 1 on this hand to frame 16. That way when it's in motion you can really see it. But I think something in between, maybe something like this pose on frame 8 will look better on frame 1 to have a more natural pose there. But overall, that's the only thing that's really sticking out on this pass with the fingers. The hand movements has some nice movement overall to keep things loose. And then if we take a look at the front view, you can see the elbows are tucked in a little bit better, a little bit more natural. You can see that the student has added some weight shifts a little bit now to the left and the right over here. So you get a little bit more sense of weight coming in. Doesn't need to be a lot, but just a little bit adds some of that weight shift that's happening. One thing that I also notice with students is that the shoulders, especially on a mannequin character like this, since things are broken up, it's kind of easy to lose track of the shoulders because there's these pieces that are broken up. So that's one thing that you'll need to be aware of when you're rotating these arms, is to try to remove any of that penetration and try to keep those shoulders to look natural. But if you don't look at this area, the arms are looking a lot more natural now that those elbows have been tucked in. You can see that there's some nice movement happening. It's looking a lot less robotic. The only thing that I think we need to kind of really work on are some of the shoulder movements that can be kind of hard to track with this mannequin character just because of how the character is modeled and everything is sectioned off. But making sure you kind of remove some of this penetration here and getting a little bit more of that contrast in the shoulders, maybe rotating it up on those weight shifts where the weight is shifting over. You might want to raise this shoulder a little bit higher and keep this one lower, and that will kind of alleviate some of that movement that we're seeing on the shoulders that looks a little bit unnatural with this rotation that's basically only kind of going around. So what we want to do is we want to kind of get some of that rotation that goes up, not just around, wrapping around here, which you can see in the movement. It's mostly rotating this way. We also want to get some movement with the shoulders going upward as well. So those are some of the basic characteristics that I notice in a lot of student work that in the lower body and the upper body regions that tends to get overlooked. There's a lot of things to track, but those are the most common areas that students tend to kind of forget about, that I end up having to kind of point out little adjustments for. So as you're working through the lower body and the upper body and polishing, try to keep your eye on those areas, the knees, the shoulders, the elbows, and your weight shifts. And those are and definitely making sure that your neck and head are aligned straight like this so that the body is balanced. And those things will all kind of add up together to make for a really natural walk cycle that will look a lot more polished than if you forget to track all of those elements together. So hopefully that's helpful. In the next section, what we'll talk about is kind of how to adjust some of those leg pops that happen in the legs while we're tracking the knees. When you get those hyperextensions in the legs, there's some controllers that need to be adjusted, and keeping an eye on those controllers will help you soften some of that. So we'll take a look at that and we'll make those adjustments so that hopefully it will give more insight onto alleviate some of those hyperextensions that happen on the key poses for the walk cycle. Looking at this Maya file, this is a really great walk cycle overall, but we can see that there's a few issues with the lower body. So it's not focused too much on the upper body at this point. And what we're going to be looking at mostly is the lower body. So if you take a look at his left leg in this section here, you can see that this knee is kind of hyperextending. This is a very common issue that students can make. The translations on his root is looking great. So you can see he's got some really nice curves as the root starts going down and up. Let's see if this is his even though we are Y or Z up for Unreal, in Maya, you're going to see the curves going up and down with X. So you can see the curve going down on the down position, and really nice smooth transitions as he's going through the passing and the up frame. So in the up frame, you can see this is the height of his root translation, and you can see here that there's still a nice bend, but then as he transitions to his contact frame, which is great, it's blending pretty nicely with his other contact frame at the beginning of the cycle, and there's a nice bend, a slight bend on the contact frame, so that's great. But what we need to do is fix this area here where we've got a pop here where the leg is hyperextending. And you can tell that it's hyperextending because you can kind of see that as I move that root translation up and down, you can see that it's kind of locked in place. Now, one other thing that we can see here is the same thing kind of happens a little bit as well in the second half of the animation, where the transition is going again from the up position down to the contact frame. So there's a few things that we can do to kind of alleviate this area. One could be to lower your height of the root translation. The other thing would be to give a little more foot roll and be able to kind of give a little more bend. So looking over at my file, I went ahead and adjusted some of these curves. I didn't really touch his root translations, but what I did was I was able to kind of finesse a little bit of the foot rolls, keeping the foot flat on the ground a little bit longer during his duration here, but also starting to transition and smooth the up position keyframe pose and kind of give a little bit of an ease into his contact frame and maintaining his maintaining the foot rolls that we had on this contact positions. One other thing I noticed was there was a little bit of a difference here on the other foot as it kind of transitioned as well to the contact position. So if you look at his file, we can kind of see that there's a little bit of a difference here in the curves. So let's pull up both curves so you can kind of see a little bit of them together. So you can compare the curves a little bit. The file here on the bottom shows the transition that I kind of created. It's a little bit of the same keys that are in place on his passing position, but then I did a small adjustment on the curves here to kind of push the leg a little bit more to kind of soften up that transition as it goes into the contact frame. So we can kind of see that that transition. And we can also kind of see a little bit of the foot cleanup as well. So they had a couple of extra frames here and just kind of smoothing out those transitions in the timeline. It also kind of eliminated some of these extra keys that we were having and basically just maintaining the same type of duration that we had earlier on the frame with the other cycle. And the same thing happened mainly with his transition here. On the top you can see his transition here with the original where we were getting that pop. And let's take a look at this small little tiny fix. So he's got frame 8, frame 12, and 16 and 18. We kept those same frames, but you can kind of see the curve differences on his versus mine. And just that small little adjustment there on the foot roll is really all the difference that is going to really help kind of give a little bit of that softer transition as you're going from the up position over to the contact position. So it looks pretty much the same on your actual keyframes. It doesn't really look visually that much different, but it makes all the difference when you're looking at these curves here and kind of just giving a little bit of that softness and adjusting just slightly to make sure that that leg doesn't pop in that transition. So that's one way you can kind of fix a little bit of those pops that you see in the leg. Sometimes there's a little bit of back and forth that you're going to have to adjust your root translations as well, just so that you can prevent any pops that happen. But I would suggest if you have a really nice flow like he does here with his root translation, I would try to maintain this root curve, which I didn't really touch, and I just started to finesse it with his foot controllers to try to break up a little bit of that that extension, that hyperextension that we're getting in the back leg. If that doesn't do it, you may need to also adjust your foot sliding a little bit in your back and forth translation on the foot. I would go for those routes first and then go to your root, but all three of these controllers, your foot roll, and your root controller, all three of those are going to be what you're going to want to look at in your graph editor to prevent those leg pops from happening. And then we can still continue to smooth some of this out. This spacing here could be adjusted a little bit more, and that really just comes down to finessing those curves a little bit more. But for the most part, when it's in motion, it's looking pretty good. There is a little bit of some jitter there that we could still clean up, but overall it's removing some of those pops that we're seeing in the original, which still looks really great. It's just we needed to kind of finesse that popping that we're seeing there. So you can see that the popping is a little more apparent in this one versus this bottom one, which is a little bit softened up. And this right leg could still be adjusted even a little bit more. So that little bit of polish makes all the difference. And that's kind of how you go about finessing some of those hyperextensions that we see in some of the walk cycles. Hopefully all of those tips and tricks are helpful for you to make a really believable walk cycle on the lower and the upper body portions. There's some great work that we've seen from some of the students here, and there's some great personality. And you can see that even though students are working with the same reference, they still are able to create a walk cycle with personality that's unique and looks great. And hopefully putting all of these elements together for your walk cycle will also allow you to make some really great improvements to some of the shortcomings that might come up with some walk cycles, and some of the best practices and things to look for as you put together your own walk cycle with your own reference. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.